The ivory place card felt heavier than it should have in my hands. Table 23, Madison Carter, was written in elegant calligraphy, the same flowing script that graced every invitation, menu, and program at my sister Emma's dream wedding. Table 23. The very last table in the corner of the ballroom, squeezed between the kitchen doors and the emergency exit, where the floral centerpieces were noticeably smaller and the linens slightly wrinkled from being stored at the bottom of the stack. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I smiled politely at the wedding coordinator who handed me the card, her practiced smile not quite reaching her eyes as she glanced at my simple navy dress among the sea of designer gowns surrounding us. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had personally written the check that paid for those very place cards. In fact, I had written every single check that made this $400,000 extravaganza possible. The grand ballroom at the Fairmont Dallas sparkled with crystal chandeliers, casting rainbow prisms across walls draped in ivory silk and gold accents. White roses imported from Ecuador cascaded from towering centerpieces, each arrangement costing more than most people's monthly rent. The champagne being poured into Waterford crystal flutes was Dom Perignon 2012, selected after Emma's 3-hour tasting session where she'd dismissed anything under $200 a bottle as embarrassingly cheap. As I made my way through the crowd of Dallas society elite toward my assigned corner, I caught fragments of conversation that painted the evening in sharp relief. "The Palmer family certainly spared no expense," whispered one woman in Chanel. "Must have cost them a fortune to secure the Fairmont on such short notice," another replied, adjusting her Hermes clutch. The Palmer family. My sister had legally changed her name 6 months ago, eager to shed any connection to our modest Carter origins. She'd told everyone that our parents, Robert and Linda Palmer, were successful entrepreneurs who'd built their wealth in tech investments. The truth was far more complex and far more painful. Robert and Linda Palmer had indeed built something valuable, but it wasn't a tech empire. It was a small but profitable chain of hardware stores across East Texas, the kind of unglamorous business that required getting your hands dirty and working 16-hour days. They'd sacrificed everything to build that modest success, including their relationship with their daughters. Dad had died of a heart attack at 58, bent over paperwork, in the back office of the Tyler location. Mom had followed 18 months later, her spirit broken by loss and exhaustion. What nobody at this glittering celebration knew was that I had sold the Palmer hardware chain for $12.8 million just 3 years ago. The inheritance that should have been split between Emma and me had become mine alone when she'd walked away at 18, declaring our family's blue-collar roots beneath her social aspirations. She'd wanted nothing to do with inventory management, supplier relationships, or the unglamorous reality of profit margins on socket wrenches and garden hoses. At 26, I'd found myself the sole owner of a business I'd never wanted, but felt obligated to preserve. It had taken me 2 years to find the right buyers, a national chain that promised to maintain the Palmer name and keep all existing employees. The day I signed those papers, I'd felt the weight of 3 generations of Carter family legacy transfer to new hands, along with the financial freedom I'd never expected to possess. Standing now in this opulent ballroom, watching Emma glide through her reception in a $15,000 Vera Wang gown, I couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought us to this moment. She'd called me 8 months ago, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. The wedding she'd planned with her fiancé Marcus Richardson was spiraling beyond their budget. Marcus came from old Dallas money, but old money in Texas often meant land rich and cash poor. The Richardson family owned thousands of acres of prime real estate but struggled with liquid assets. "Madison, I need help," she'd said during that late-night phone call, her carefully cultivated confidence cracking to reveal the scared girl I remembered from our childhood. "Marcus's family is expecting a certain level of presentation. If we can't deliver the wedding they're anticipating, his grandmother might reconsider the trust fund distribution. The Richardson Family Trust was legendary in Dallas social circles. Marcus's great-grandfather had made a fortune in oil during the 1940s, and the family had been living off carefully managed investments ever since. But access to the principal required meeting certain family expectations, including marrying someone the matriarch, Eleanor Richardson, deemed appropriate for the family name. Emma had been dating Marcus for 3 years, carefully cultivating her image as the perfect society wife-to-be. She'd taken etiquette classes, joined the junior league, and completely reinvented her personal history to align with Richardson family values. The wedding wasn't just a celebration, it was her final examination, the ultimate test of whether she could convincingly perform the role of wealthy heiress worthy of joining their dynasty. "How much do you need?" I'd asked, already knowing the answer would be substantial. Everything's been priced assuming the Richardson family would cover traditional groom expenses, but Marcus finally admitted they're stretched thin with some bad investments last year. "The venue deposit alone is $50,000, and we're looking at another $300,000 for flowers, catering, photography, the dress, everything else." I'd felt a familiar pang of responsibility mixed with frustration. Despite years of Emma's dismissive treatment, despite her obvious embarrassment about our family background, I couldn't bring myself to let her fail when she'd finally asked for help. Perhaps it was guilt over the inheritance she'd never claimed, or maybe it was the protective instinct that had never quite faded despite our strained relationship. "I'll take care of it," I'd told her, the words leaving my mouth before I'd fully processed the decision. The relief in her voice had been palpable. "Madison, thank you. I know we haven't been close, but this means everything to me. I promise I'll pay you back once Marcus and I are established." We both knew she'd never pay me back, but I'd made peace with that reality. What I hadn't anticipated was how completely she'd erase my contribution from the narrative of her perfect wedding day. Over the following months, I'd quietly handled every financial aspect of the celebration: the venue, the catering, the flowers, the photography, the designer dress, the destination bachelor and bachelorette parties, even the custom jewelry Emma wore tonight. Each vendor had been instructed to send invoices to my business manager, with strict instructions to maintain confidentiality about the payment source. Emma had wanted to avoid any questions about funding sources from the Richardson family, so we'd agreed the financial arrangement would remain private. What I hadn't expected was to be treated like a distant acquaintance at the actual event. The seating chart had been my first indication of how thoroughly Emma had compartmentalized my role in her new life. When she'd called to discuss arrangements, her tone had been apologetic, but firm. "Madison, I hope you understand about the seating. Eleanor Richardson has very specific ideas about table placements, and she's insisted on organizing everything. According to social connections and business relationships, Table 23 wasn't just physically distant from the head table where Emma and Marcus held court with Dallas's social elite. It was a deliberate statement about my place in the carefully constructed hierarchy of her new existence. I was seated with Marcus's college roommate's younger sister, a few distant cousins from Emma's fabricated Palmer family backstory, and several other guests who didn't quite fit the evening's social narrative. From my corner position, I had a perfect view of the elaborate spectacle I'd financed. The 20-piece orchestra played classical selections while guests dined on Wagyu beef and Maine lobster, their conversations floating across the ballroom in a symphony of privilege and assumption. I watched Emma work the room with practiced grace, accepting congratulations and compliments about the stunning celebration with the poise of someone born to such luxury. Marcus stood beside her, handsome in his custom tuxedo, playing his role as the charming heir with natural ease. His family had been performing this particular brand of gracious wealth for 4 generations, and it showed in every gesture and smile. They moved through their social obligations with the confidence of people who'd never questioned their right to such extravagance. The irony wasn't lost on me that while I sat in the back corner like an afterthought, every detail of the evening reflected my financial contribution. The champagne being poured was my champagne. The flowers that earned countless compliments had been selected from my budget. Even the custom lighting that cast such a romantic glow over the dance floor had been installed with my money. But perhaps the most painful aspect wasn't the financial ingratitude. It was the complete erasure of our shared history. Emma had crafted a personal mythology that positioned her as naturally belonging to this world of wealth and privilege. In her version of events, she was simply reclaiming her rightful place among Dallas society, finally able to celebrate in the manner befitting her refined background. The few guests who knew our real story had been strategically seated far from the Richardson family tables, preventing any awkward conversations about hardware stores or East Texas origins. Emma had even coached me on what to say if anyone asked about my background. I was to describe myself as working in investment management, which was technically true, but deliberately vague enough to avoid uncomfortable details. As the evening progressed, I found myself observing the celebration with a mixture of pride and melancholy. Despite the personal cost and social humiliation, I had to admit, Emma had achieved something remarkable. She'd successfully transformed herself into the woman she'd always believed she was meant to be, creating a new identity so convincing that even she seemed to believe it completely. The wedding was flawless in every detail, a masterpiece of planning and execution that would be remembered for years in Dallas social circles. Photos would grace society pages, and the Richardson family would welcome Emma into their dynasty with full confidence in her appropriateness as Marcus's wife. By every measure that mattered to her, the evening was a complete success. Yet sitting at my corner table, watching strangers enjoy the celebration I'd made possible while being treated as an inconvenient reminder of Emma's inconvenient past, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had been lost in her transformation. The sister I'd grown up with, the girl who'd once shared dreams and secrets and silly jokes, had been carefully erased to make room for this new version of herself. What Emma didn't realize, as she basked in the admiration of Dallas society, was that her carefully constructed new identity rested on a foundation she'd never acknowledged. Every smile, every compliment, every approving nod from the Richardson family was built on generosity she'd already forgotten and sacrifice she'd never recognized. As the orchestra began playing the couple's first dance, I raised my glass of champagne, the champagne I'd purchased, and silently toasted the sister I'd lost and the woman she'd become. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult conversations, but tonight belonged to Emma's perfect performance in the life she'd always wanted. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The crystal flute caught the light from the chandeliers above, casting tiny rainbows across the white tablecloth as I drank to the most expensive gift I'd ever given, and the most painful lesson I'd ever learned about the true cost of unconditional love. The path that led me to writing those checks began on a sweltering August morning in Tyler, Texas, when I was 24 years old and thought I understood what my future looked like. I'd been working as a junior analyst at a mid-sized investment firm in Houston, living in a cramped apartment with a roommate who left dirty dishes in the sink for weeks. My plan was simple: climb the corporate ladder, maybe start my own practice, eventually, and visit home every few months to help Dad with the books at Palmer Hardware. That morning, Mom's voice on the phone shattered everything I thought I knew about tomorrow. "Madison, you need to come home. Your father collapsed at the store this morning." The 3-hour drive from Houston to Tyler passed in a blur of phone calls to hospitals, insurance companies, and Emma, who was living in Los Angeles at the time, pursuing what she called her lifestyle brand development, but what looked suspiciously like living off credit cards and wealthy boyfriends. Dad had suffered a massive heart attack while reviewing quarterly inventory reports. Bill Martinez, our longest-tenured employee, found him slumped over the desk in the back office of the flagship Tyler location, surrounded by spreadsheets and supplier invoices. By the time the paramedics arrived, Robert Carter was already gone, leaving behind a business he'd built with his bare hands and a family who'd never fully appreciated the weight of his responsibility. The funeral filled the largest church in Tyler, a testament to the quiet impact Dad had made in our community. Employees, customers, suppliers, and competitors all came to pay respects to a man who'd treated everyone with dignity, regardless of their station in life. Mrs. Henderson, who'd been buying gardening supplies from Palmer Hardware for 30 years, told me through tears that Dad had personally delivered a wheelbarrow to her house when she couldn't afford the delivery fee. "He never made anyone feel small," she said, gripping my hand with weathered fingers. "Rich or poor, your daddy treated folks like they mattered." Emma arrived the day before the service, stepping out of a rented BMW wearing designer sunglasses that probably cost more than most of our employees made in a week. She hugged me briefly at the airport, her perfume expensive and unfamiliar, her conversation filled with references to people and places that belonged to a world I'd never seen. "I'm so sorry I couldn't get here sooner," she said as we drove toward home. "I was in the middle of this incredibly important networking event in Malibu. You know how it is with these things. The connections you make can change everything." I didn't know, actually. My networking events happened at industry conferences where people wore name tags and discussed municipal bond strategies over coffee that came from hotel catering urns. But I nodded and asked about her life, trying to bridge the gap that seemed to widen every time we spoke. She'd been living in California for 6 years by then, chasing opportunities in fashion, entertainment, lifestyle consulting, whatever caught. Her attention and promised access to wealthy social circles. Her Instagram feed showed a carefully curated life of rooftop parties, exclusive restaurants, and designer everything, though I'd noticed she never posted anything that revealed where the money came from. "I've been seeing someone wonderful," she said as we pulled into our parents' driveway. "His name is Trevor, and he's in real estate development. Really high-end stuff, luxury resorts, private clubs. He's been teaching me so much about how business really works at the highest levels." The house looked smaller than I remembered, the vinyl siding showing its age despite Dad's meticulous maintenance. Mom met us at the door, her face drawn with grief, but her embrace still warm with the strength that had held our family together through decades of challenges. Over dinner that night, the three of us sat around the kitchen table where we'd shared thousands of meals, and Emma asked the question that would define the next phase of all our lives. "What happens to the business now?" Mom looked older than her 56 years, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had been Dad's favorite. "I honestly don't know, sweetheart. Your father handled all the business side of things. I helped with bookkeeping and customer service, but the strategic decisions, the supplier relationships, the expansion plans, that was all Robert." Palmer Hardware had grown from a single storefront to 6 locations across East Texas, employing 43 people and serving communities from Tyler to Marshall to Longview. Dad had built something significant, but it was the kind of success that required constant attention and deep understanding of the industry. "Maybe it's time to sell," Emma said, her tone casual as if we were discussing what to have for breakfast. "I mean, Mom, you shouldn't have to deal with all that stress on top of grieving. And honestly, neither Madison nor I know anything about running hardware stores." Her words stung because they were partially true. I understood financial analysis and business strategy in theory, but I'd never managed inventory or dealt with suppliers or handled the day-to-day challenges of retail operations. Emma, meanwhile, had actively avoided learning anything about the family business, viewing it as beneath the sophisticated image she'd been cultivating. "Your father always hoped one of you girls might take an interest," Mom said quietly. "He used to talk about passing it down, keeping it in the family. He was so proud of what he'd built." The conversation continued late into the night, with Emma, making increasingly urgent arguments for selling quickly and dividing the proceeds. She painted pictures of Mom's comfortable retirement and our freedom to pursue other opportunities without the burden of managing a business neither of us had chosen. But something about her eagerness to liquidate Dad's life's work bothered me profoundly. This wasn't just a business. It was a legacy, a testament to the values Robert Carter had lived by. It employed people who'd been with us for decades, served communities that depended on our expertise and service, and represented everything Dad had believed about the dignity of honest work. The reading of the will 2 weeks later revealed the complexity of Dad's final wishes. He'd left the business jointly to Emma and me, with Mom maintaining a lifetime interest in the family home and a guaranteed income from business profits. But there was a provision that surprised everyone. If either daughter chose not to participate in running the business, her share would automatically transfer to the remaining daughter after a 2-year waiting period. Emma's reaction was immediate and predictable. "I can't spend 2 years tied up in this," she announced as we left the lawyer's office. "Madison, I have opportunities in California that I can't wait for. I need to get back to my real life." "This is real life too," I said, gesturing toward the Palmer Hardware sign visible from the parking lot. "Dad built something meaningful here. Don't you think we owe it to him to at least try?" Her laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Madison, be realistic. I'm building connections with people who could change everything for me. I can't put that on hold to learn about socket wrenches and paint samples. You're good with numbers and business stuff. This is more your thing anyway." That phrase, "your thing," stayed with me for weeks, as if Dad's life's work was just a hobby I might find interesting rather than a responsibility we both inherited. As if the 43 people who depended on Palmer Hardware for their livelihoods were just abstract concepts rather than families, with mortgages and dreams. Emma returned to California within a month, officially renouncing any claim to the business in exchange for me taking over her obligations to Mom's financial security. I quit my job in Houston and moved back to Tyler, spending my days learning everything Dad had never had the chance to teach me. Bill Martinez became my unofficial mentor, walking me through supplier relationships, inventory management, seasonal fluctuations, and the thousands of details that kept the business running. At 62, he'd been with Palmer Hardware since its second year of operation, and he possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of every aspect of the operation. "Your daddy was a good man," he told me during one of our late-night inventory sessions. "He never forgot where he came from, never looked down on the work. Some folks think selling hammers and nails is simple, but your daddy understood it's really about solving problems for people who need help fixing things. Those first months were brutal. I made mistakes that cost us money, misread market trends, that left us overstocked on items that wouldn't sell, and struggled to balance the competing demands of 6 different locations. But gradually, I began to understand the rhythms of the business and the satisfaction that came from genuine usefulness. When Mrs. Chen came in looking for specific screws to repair her grandmother's antique jewelry box, and I was able to find exactly what she needed, I felt a pride that none of my investment analysis successes had ever provided. When our Tyler location became the go-to source for contractors working on the new hospital construction project, I understood why Dad had talked about the dignity of essential work. Emma called sporadically during this period, her updates filled with excitement about parties she'd attended and people she'd met, but never asking about how I was managing the transition or whether I needed support. She'd moved to Dallas by then, having connected with Marcus Richardson at some charity function, and her conversation increasingly focused on the Richardson family's social prominence and business connections. "You should see their ranch," she told me during one call. "It's like something from a movie. Horse stables, guest houses, a lake with its own beach. Marcus's grandmother has been telling me about all the family traditions, the annual Christmas party that everyone important in Dallas attends. It's the kind of life I've always known I was meant for." She'd begun using phrases like, "always known," "I was meant for," and the kind of people who really understand quality with increasing frequency. Her transformation from Emma Carter of Tyler, Texas, to Emma Palmer of Dallas High Society was deliberate and thorough, complete with vocal coaching to soften her East Texas accent and etiquette lessons to perfect her table manners. 2 years. After Dad's death, I formally became the sole owner of Palmer Hardware. Mom signed the papers with tears in her eyes, proud of what I'd accomplished, but mourning the family unity that had been lost in the process. "Your father would be so proud," she said as we left the lawyer's office. "You saved everything he built." But the weight of that responsibility was heavier than I'd anticipated. Running 6 stores required constant attention, strategic planning, and sacrifices I hadn't expected to make. My social life disappeared as evenings were consumed by paperwork and planning. Romantic relationships became impossible to maintain. When I was always on call for emergencies at one location or another, the business was profitable and growing, but success came at the cost of the personal life I'd imagined for myself. Meanwhile, Emma's social media presence showcased a lifestyle of leisure and luxury that seemed designed to emphasize how different our choices had been. The decision to sell came 3 years later, when a national chain approached with an offer that recognized both the financial value of our locations and the intangible worth of our reputation. They promised to maintain the Palmer Hardware name, retain all existing employees, and preserve the customer service standards Dad had established. The negotiation process took 6 months, but the final agreement exceeded my expectations. 12.8 million for a business Dad had started with $15,000 borrowed against our house. The buyers structured the deal to protect employee interests and maintain community connections, honoring everything Dad had cared about while providing financial security I'd never imagined possible. The day I signed those papers, I felt the strangest mixture of relief and loss. I was free from the daily grind of retail management, financially secure beyond my wildest dreams, but also severed from the last tangible connection to the man who'd shaped my understanding of work, integrity, and responsibility. Emma's reaction to news of the sale was telling. Her first question wasn't about honoring Dad's memory or protecting his employees, but about how the money would be divided and when she might expect her share. "I know I signed away my legal claim," she said during a tense phone conversation, "but morally, don't you think some of that money belongs to me too? I am his daughter, after all." The conversation that followed revealed the fundamental difference in how we understood family, responsibility, and fairness. Emma saw the inheritance as something she'd been cheated out of by circumstance and poor timing. I saw it as compensation for sacrifices she'd never been willing to make and responsibilities she'd actively avoided. That was the last meaningful conversation we had until the phone call about her wedding 8 months later. In the intervening time, she'd become engaged to Marcus, changed her legal name to Palmer, and crafted an elaborate backstory that positioned our parents as successful entrepreneurs rather than hardworking retailers. When she finally asked for help with the wedding, I understood it wasn't really about money. It was about validation, about proving that her transformation into Dallas society had been worth the cost of everything she'd left behind. And despite years of hurt and frustration, I couldn't bring myself to let her fail when she'd finally asked for something I had the power to provide. The morning after Emma's desperate phone call, I sat in my downtown Dallas office reviewing the financial reality of her situation. My business manager, Patricia Wells, had compiled a comprehensive breakdown of the wedding costs Emma had outlined during our conversation. The numbers were staggering, even by Dallas High Society standards. $400,000 for a single. "Evening?" Patricia said, sliding the detailed budget across my mahogany desk. "That's not including the engagement party they already had or the honeymoon expenses. Are you certain about this, Madison?" Patricia had been managing my finances since the Palmer Hardware sale, and she'd never questioned my investment decisions or charitable contributions. But this was different. This wasn't a business opportunity or a tax-deductible donation. This was a family drama with a price tag that could buy a luxury home. "I'm certain," I replied, studying the line items. Venue rental, catering, florals, photography, videography, music, transportation, accommodations for out-of-town guests, Emma's dress and accessories, Marcus's custom tuxedo, wedding party gifts, invitations, decorations, every detail of their dream celebration itemized and priced. The complexity of coordinating payment became immediately apparent. Emma couldn't simply hand vendors a business card with my name on it without raising questions about funding sources. The Richardson family expected their future daughter-in-law to possess the financial resources befitting their social status, not to rely on mysterious benefactors. "We'll need to establish a discrete payment structure," I told Patricia. "Emma needs plausible explanations for how she's covering these expenses without revealing external financing." Over the following weeks, we developed an intricate system of shell companies and intermediary accounts that would allow me to fund the wedding while maintaining Emma's carefully constructed image. Patricia established Magnolia Events LLC, a legitimate event planning company that would serve as the primary contractor for all wedding services. The genius of this structure was its simplicity. Emma could truthfully tell anyone who asked that her wedding was being handled by a professional planning company, while I remained invisible as the silent financial backer. Vendors received payments from Magnolia Events, which appeared to be a standard business arrangement rather than personal charity. But coordinating this elaborate financial choreography required constant communication with Emma, and those conversations revealed troubling aspects of her transformation that I hadn't fully understood before. "The Richardson family has very specific expectations about presentation," she explained during one of our planning calls. "Eleanor has been mentoring me on proper protocol for family events. Apparently, Marcus's cousin Sarah had a wedding 2 years ago that was considered disappointing by family standards, and it affected how she's been treated ever since." Eleanor Richardson wielded social power like a medieval queen, determining which family members received invitations to important gatherings, access to family business opportunities, and inclusion in philanthropic activities that defined Dallas, high society. Emma understood intuitively that her wedding would serve as Eleanor's final evaluation of her worthiness to join the Richardson dynasty. "She's been testing me," Emma continued, her voice tight with anxiety. "Little comments about my background, questions about my family's business interests, observations about my social connections. I can tell she's still deciding whether I'm appropriate for Marcus." The pressure Emma felt was real and understandable, but her solution, completely reinventing her personal history, created complications neither of us had anticipated. She'd told the Richardson family that our parents had built a successful technology consulting business before retiring to travel extensively. When Eleanor expressed interest in meeting them, Emma had to craft elaborate excuses about their unavailability due to ongoing international commitments. "What happens when they eventually want to meet Mom?" I asked during one particularly tense conversation. "I'm hoping to buy enough time to coach her properly," Emma replied. "Mom's smart enough to learn the right things to say about our background. It's just a matter of preparation." The casual way she discussed transforming our grieving mother into a prop for her social performance revealed how thoroughly Emma had compartmentalized her old life from her new identity. She wasn't just hiding financial dependence, she was erasing the fundamental truth of who we were and where we came from. My role in this deception grew more complex as wedding planning intensified. Emma needed me to attend venue visits, cake, tastings, and floral consultations to approve expenses, but I had to remain invisible to prevent awkward questions about my involvement. This led to an absurd series of covert meetings and coded communications that made planning her wedding feel like orchestrating an international espionage operation. The most challenging aspect was managing vendor relationships without revealing my identity. I attended meetings disguised as Patricia's assistant or as a representative of Magnolia Events, taking notes and asking questions while Emma made final decisions. The vendors assumed I was hired help rather than the actual financial decision-maker, which required swallowing my pride on multiple occasions. During one particularly elaborate floral consultation at Dallas's most exclusive flower shop, the designer spent 20 minutes explaining to Emma why certain orchid varieties were more prestigious than others, completely ignoring my presence despite the fact that I was the one who would ultimately approve the $35,000 floral budget. The Richardson family has used our services for 3 generations, the designer explained, showing Emma exotic blooms that cost more per stem than most people spent on entire bouquets. We understand their aesthetic preferences and social expectations. Emma nodded earnestly, asking informed questions about color palettes and arrangement styles, playing her role as the sophisticated bride perfectly. Meanwhile, I sat in the corner taking notes about delivery logistics and setup requirements, invisible to everyone except the one person whose opinion actually mattered for finalizing the contract. These experiences taught me uncomfortable lessons about social invisibility and the power of assumption. When people believed I was employed rather than in charge, they treated me with casual dismissiveness that revealed their true attitudes about class and worth. Emma never seemed to notice these interactions or consider how they might affect me, too focused on her own performance to recognize the irony of the situation. The venue selection process proved particularly revealing about the Richardson family dynamics. Eleanor had strong opinions about appropriate locations, dismissing several beautiful options as either too trendy or lacking proper heritage. The Fairmont Dallas ultimately won approval not just for its elegance, but for its history of hosting prominent society events. This is where the Petroleum Club held their centennial celebration, Eleanor noted approvingly during our tour. The ballroom has the right proportions for a proper reception, and the guest list will be impressed by the venue choice. Emma absorbed every comment Eleanor made, filing away preferences and prejudices that would guide future social decisions. I watched this education in real time, seeing how thoroughly Emma was being molded into the Richardson family's idea of an appropriate wife and future matriarch. The photography contract negotiations revealed another layer of complexity. Emma wanted a specific photographer whose portfolio showcased Dallas's most prominent families, but his standard fee exceeded her stated budget by considerable margin. Rather than admit to financial constraints, she needed creative ways to justify the additional expense. Perhaps we could book him for engagement photos as well, I suggested during one of our covert planning sessions. That would justify the higher overall cost as bundled services rather than premium wedding pricing. Emma embraced this solution enthusiastically, scheduling an elaborate engagement session that would provide plenty of sophisticated images for her social media presence, while making the wedding photography seem like a natural extension of an existing relationship. The engagement photos, shot at the Richardson family ranch and Dallas Arboretum, perfectly captured Emma's transformation into her new identity. She looked radiant and confident, every inch the sophisticated heiress she'd always wanted to be. Marcus appeared comfortable and proud, genuinely happy with his choice of partner. But studying those images afterward, I felt a complex mixture of pride and sadness. Emma had achieved something remarkable through sheer force of will and careful planning. She'd successfully convinced one of Dallas's most prominent families that she belonged among them, earning acceptance into social circles that had seemed impossibly distant during our East Texas childhood. Yet the woman in those photographs was almost unrecognizable as the sister I'd grown up with. Her posture, her expressions, even her smile had been refined and perfected to match Richardson family expectations. She'd become exactly who she'd always wanted to be, but at the cost of any connection to who she'd actually been. The catering. Arrangements required similar delicate navigation. Emma wanted a menu sophisticated enough to impress the Richardson family's refined palates, while appearing to make decisions based on personal preference rather than budget constraints. We spent hours reviewing options, with me discreetly approving upgrades while Emma performed the role of discerning bride. "The Wagyu beef is certainly impressive," she mused during one tasting, as if considering whether the premium option aligned with her refined tastes, rather than calculating whether I would approve the additional expense. Marcus's family appreciates quality ingredients, and this would certainly meet their expectations. These performances became routine, with Emma consulting me privately about financial decisions while maintaining public appearances of independent wealth and sophisticated judgment. The constant deception required extraordinary attention to detail and perfect coordination between us, skills neither of us had developed through previous experience. The dress selection process epitomized everything complex about our arrangement. Emma needed a gown that would photograph beautifully, impress Eleanor Richardson, and establish her credibility as a worthy addition to Dallas high society. But she also needed to justify spending $15,000 on a dress without admitting to external financial support. "I've been saving for my dream dress since college," she explained to the consultant at Neiman Marcus, as if she'd been planning this specific purchase for years rather than scrambling to find funding just months earlier. "This is definitely an investment piece that I'll treasure forever." The consultant nodded approvingly, probably assuming Emma came from the kind of family where $15,000 dresses were expected rather than extraordinary. Meanwhile, I sat nearby pretending to browse accessories while actually evaluating whether the dress choice justified its impact on our overall budget. Watching Emma try on designer gowns, seeing her face light up when she found the perfect Vera Wong creation, I felt genuine happiness for her achievement. She looked absolutely stunning, radiant with the confidence that comes from knowing you've found exactly the right choice. At that moment, the cost seemed irrelevant compared to the joy she experienced. But the complexity of maintaining our secret, financial arrangement grew more challenging as the wedding date approached. Every decision required careful coordination, every expense needed plausible explanation, and every interaction with vendors demanded perfect performance of our respective roles. The bachelor and bachelorette party arrangements pushed our deception to new levels of complexity. Emma wanted destination celebrations that would impress her new social circle. Las Vegas for Marcus's bachelor party, Napa Valley for her bachelorette weekend. Both required covering not just her own expenses, but contributing to group costs, to ensure the celebrations met her expectations. "It's traditional for the bride and groom's families to help with pre-wedding events," she explained when requesting additional funding. "The Richardson family is covering most of Marcus's expenses, so I need to match their level of contribution." This meant coordinating payments for luxury accommodations, private dining experiences, transportation, and entertainment for groups of people who had no idea their fun was being subsidized by Emma's estranged sister. The logistics alone required Patricia's full-time attention for several weeks. As these elaborate plans came together, I began to understand the true scope of what Emma was attempting. She wasn't just planning a wedding, she was orchestrating her final transformation from Emma Carter of Tyler, Texas, to Emma Palmer Richardson of Dallas high society. Every detail had been calculated to support this metamorphosis, and my financial contribution was the invisible foundation that made everything possible. The question that haunted me as we approached the wedding date was whether Emma would remember, after her successful transformation was complete, that none of it would have been possible without the sister she'd literally seated in the back corner of her new life. 3 weeks before the wedding, everything began unraveling in ways I never could have anticipated. The first sign of trouble came during what should have been a routine final walkthrough at the Fairmont Dallas. Emma arrived 40 minutes late, her usual composed demeanor replaced by barely controlled panic. "We have a problem," she announced, gripping my arm with enough force to leave marks. "Eleanor Richardson knows something isn't right about our family's financial situation." My blood went cold. "What exactly does she know?" Emma pulled me into an empty conference room adjacent to the ballroom where her reception would take place in just weeks. Her hands shook as she retrieved her phone, scrolling through text messages with frantic urgency. Yesterday at the country club, Eleanor cornered me during lunch. She started asking very specific questions about our parents' technology business. What kind of consulting they did, which companies they worked with, why they weren't more involved in Dallas business circles despite supposedly being successful entrepreneurs. The interrogation Emma described sounded like a professional investigation disguised as casual conversation. Eleanor Richardson hadn't built her social empire by accepting surface appearances. She'd developed sophisticated methods for verifying the backgrounds of potential family additions, and Emma's story was beginning to crack under scrutiny. She mentioned having friends who work in technology consulting, Emma continued, her voice rising with anxiety. She offered to make introductions between our parents and some of her business connections. When I tried to deflect by saying they were too busy traveling, she suggested we coordinate schedules for a dinner party specifically to honor them. This was exactly the scenario we'd both feared but never adequately planned for. Eleanor Richardson's insistence on meeting Emma's parents would expose the elaborate fiction about their business success and current lifestyle. Mom was still grieving, living quietly in the same modest house where we'd grown up, nowhere near, prepared to perform the role of successful tech entrepreneur. There's more, Emma said, showing me her phone screen. Look at this text from Marcus. The message was brief, but ominous. Mother's friend Amanda Phillips says she can't find any record of Palmer Technology Consulting in industry databases. She's confused about why such a successful company would have no online presence. We should discuss. Amanda Phillips was exactly the kind of connection we should have anticipated. Wealthy Dallas families didn't just accept newcomers at face value, they verified backgrounds through extensive social networks that included people with access to professional databases and industry connections. How did you respond to Marcus? I asked, already calculating the damage control required. I told him our parents have always been very private about their business, that they prefer personal relationships over online marketing. But Madison, I could tell he didn't believe me. There was this look in his eyes like he was seeing me differently. The foundation of Emma's carefully constructed identity was crumbling, and the wedding was too close to postpone without creating a scandal that would destroy her social prospects permanently. We needed immediate solutions to problems that required months of preparation to solve properly. We have two choices, I said, forcing myself to think strategically despite the urgency of the situation. Either we find a way to make your story verifiable, or we come up with a new explanation that's closer to the truth. Emma's face went pale at the suggestion of honesty. I can't tell them about hardware stores, Madison. You don't understand how these people think. Eleanor Richardson considers retail trade beneath her family's social status. If she discovers I come from that background, she'll find a way to prevent the marriage. Her fear was probably justified. The Richardson family's wealth came from oil, investments and real estate holdings, passive income that required no daily labor. They'd built their identity around the distinction between working for money and having money work for them. Emma's background in retail management would confirm their worst suspicions about her appropriateness as a family addition. Then we need to create documentation for Palmer Technology Consulting, I decided. We have 3 weeks to build enough online presence and business history to satisfy basic verification attempts. What followed was the most intense period of deception I'd ever orchestrated. Patricia Wells connected me with a specialized firm that helped executives manage their digital footprints. Within 48 hours, they'd created a professional website for Palmer Technology Consulting, complete with service descriptions, client testimonials, and archived press releases dating back 5 years. The company we invented specialized in helping small businesses implement digital systems, vague enough to explain why it wouldn't have high visibility in major industry publications, but sophisticated enough to justify the success Emma had claimed. We created LinkedIn profiles for our fictional parents, complete with professional headshots and carefully crafted work histories. But building believable documentation was only half the challenge. We also needed to prepare Mom for potential interactions with the Richardson family, and that meant revealing the full scope of Emma's deception about our background. The conversation with Mom was one of the most difficult I'd ever initiated. Sitting in her living room, surrounded by photos of our real family history, I explained how Emma had reinvented our parents as successful tech entrepreneurs and why maintaining this fiction was now essential for her wedding to proceed. She told. "Them what?" Mom asked, her voice mixing disbelief with hurt. "Madison, why would Emma be ashamed of what your father built? He was proud of those stores, proud of the customers he served." "I know, Mom, but Emma needs the Richardson family to see her as their social equal. In their world, retail business doesn't carry the same prestige as technology consulting." Mom was quiet for a long time, staring at a framed photo of Dad cutting the ribbon at the grand opening of our Longview location. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but sad. "If this is what Emma needs for her happiness, I'll do my best to help. But I won't pretend to be ashamed of your father's work or the life we built together." Over the following days, I coached Mom on the basic details of Palmer Technology Consulting, helping her memorize enough information to handle casual conversations without revealing the deception. She proved remarkably adaptable, her natural intelligence allowing her to quickly grasp the technical concepts she might need to discuss. Meanwhile, Emma's anxiety continued escalating as additional complications emerged. Marcus's cousin David, who worked in venture capital, mentioned wanting to discuss potential investment opportunities with Emma's parents. Eleanor Richardson suggested hosting a dinner party where several family friends could meet the mysterious Palmer parents who'd remained invisible despite their supposed success. "Every solution creates new problems," Emma complained during one of our emergency planning sessions. "If we make our parents too available, someone will ask questions we can't answer. If we keep them too isolated, people will get suspicious about why successful entrepreneurs are so antisocial." The pressure was affecting Emma's behavior in ways that threatened to expose our secret financial arrangement. During a final vendor meeting, she snapped at the florist about a minor change to the centerpiece design, her stress manifesting as imperious demands that seemed inconsistent with someone who should be grateful for exceptional service. "Mrs. Palmer, we're happy to make adjustments," the florist said carefully. "But these last-minute changes will require additional fees for redesign and sourcing." Emma's response revealed how thoroughly she'd internalized her new identity. "Cost is not a concern. I simply expect the arrangements to match my specifications exactly." But when we left the meeting, Emma immediately turned to me with panic in her eyes. "The additional fees are going to be another $8,000. Can Magnolia Events cover that?" These moments of slippage, between her public performance of wealth and private dependence on my financial support, were becoming more frequent as wedding stress intensified. Emma was struggling to maintain consistent character portrayals across different audiences while managing the emotional pressure of impending marriage into a family that might reject her if they discovered the truth. The bachelor and bachelorette parties created additional complications when several participants mentioned wanting to stay in touch with Emma's parents after meeting them at the wedding. She'd made up detailed stories about their travels and business activities during weekend celebrations, creating expectations for future relationships that would be impossible to maintain. Sarah Richardson said she's excited to discuss European market opportunities with my father, Emma reported after returning from Napa Valley. Apparently, she's considering expanding her art gallery business internationally and thinks his consulting expertise could be valuable. Every conversation Emma had with the Richardson family created new obligations and expectations that required increasingly elaborate deceptions to maintain. We were building a house of cards that grew more unstable with each additional layer, but too much had been invested to abandon the project now. The most dangerous complication emerged when Eleanor Richardson announced her intention to have Emma's background professionally verified through a private investigation service. This wasn't unusual for prominent families protecting substantial inheritances, but it represented an existential threat to everything we'd constructed. She presented. "It is standard family protocol," Emma explained, her voice barely above a whisper. She said the Richardson family has used the same investigative firm for 3 generations to verify the backgrounds of potential spouses and business partners. A professional investigation would quickly expose every aspect of our deception. No amount of hastily created online presence could withstand scrutiny from experienced investigators who specialized in verifying wealthy families' backgrounds. "How much time do we have?" I asked, already knowing the answer would be insufficient. "She's hiring them next week. She wants the report completed before the wedding." We'd reached the point where our carefully orchestrated deception was about to collide with professional verification services. The investigation would reveal the truth about Palmer Hardware, our parents' actual background, and Emma's complete reinvention of her personal history. But perhaps most dangerously, a thorough investigation might also uncover the financial arrangements that had made the wedding possible. If professional investigators started tracing payment sources for wedding expenses, they'd eventually discover Magnolia Events LLC and my role as the secret benefactor funding Emma's transformation. "There's one more thing," Emma said, her voice breaking. "Marcus has been acting strange lately. Not suspicious exactly, but distant. Like he's reconsidering something important." The timing of Marcus's emotional withdrawal, coinciding with mounting questions about Emma's background, suggested that doubts about her authenticity were affecting their relationship in ways that went beyond family approval. If Marcus began questioning his decision to marry Emma, all our elaborate planning would become irrelevant. Standing in that conference room at the Fairmont Dallas, 3 weeks before a wedding that had consumed months of planning and hundreds of thousands of dollars, I realized we'd created a situation with no safe exit strategy. Emma couldn't withdraw from the marriage without destroying her social prospects permanently. She couldn't survive professional investigation without exposing years of deception, and she couldn't move forward without risking discovery that would devastate not just her reputation, but potentially my own business relationships if my financial involvement became public knowledge. The wedding we'd planned as Emma's triumph was becoming a trap that threatened to destroy everything both of us had built. And with each passing day, the walls were closing in faster than we could construct new defenses. The phone call that changed everything came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, exactly 10 days before Emma's wedding. I was reviewing quarterly investment reports in my home office when Patricia's number appeared on my screen, her voice tight with urgency. "Madison, we have a situation." Channel 8. News just aired a story about charitable donations in Dallas. They featured prominent families who've made significant contributions to local causes, and they mentioned the Richardson family's foundation work. My coffee went cold as Patricia continued explaining what seemed like a routine news story until she reached the devastating detail. The reporter interviewed several foundation board members about major donors, and Eleanor Richardson was prominently featured. During the interview, she mentioned being excited about her son's upcoming wedding and how pleased the family was to welcome Emma Palmer, whose parents had built a successful technology consulting business. I felt the first flutter of panic. "That doesn't sound like a crisis, Patricia." "The crisis is what happened after the story aired." Within 2 hours, the Channel 8 newsroom received a call from Bill Martinez. Bill Martinez, my father's longtime employee who'd become my mentor during the transition period at Palmer Hardware. The man who'd worked alongside Robert Carter for 37 years and knew every detail of our family's actual history. Bill saw Eleanor Richardson on television talking about the Palmer family's technology business, and he was confused, Patricia continued. He called the news station to clarify that the Palmer family had owned hardware stores, not technology companies. He was trying to be helpful, thinking there might be some confusion about which Palmer family was being discussed. The room seemed to spin around me. In one phone call, motivated by genuine desire to help, Bill Martinez had exposed the fundamental lie underlying Emma's entire transformation. Worse, He'd done it to a news organization that would certainly follow up on such an interesting discrepancy. What exactly did he tell them? I asked, already knowing the answer would be catastrophic. Everything. He explained that Robert and Linda Palmer had owned Palmer Hardware, that Robert had died of a heart attack at the Tyler store, that Linda had passed away 18 months later, and that their daughter Madison had eventually sold the business. He mentioned Emma as Robert's other daughter who'd moved to California years ago. The reporter who'd received Bill's call was Jennifer Walsh, an investigative journalist known for exposing social fraud among Dallas's elite families. She'd built her career on stories about fake pedigrees, manufactured wealth, and society scandals. Bill Martinez had handed her the story of the decade. "Jennifer Walsh has been calling our office all morning," Patricia reported. "She's also been trying to reach you directly, Emma, and even contacted the Fairmont Dallas asking about the Palmer-Richardson wedding arrangements. Within hours, what had been our private family deception was becoming a public investigation that would expose not just Emma's lies, but potentially my role as the secret financial backer. If Jennifer Walsh discovered the payment trail from Magnolia Events LLC back to my accounts, the scandal would expand beyond Emma's social climbing to questions about my own business ethics and motivations. I called Emma immediately, reaching her at the Richardson family ranch where she'd been staying for the final week before the wedding. Her voice when she answered was barely recognizable, high-pitched with terror and completely stripped of the confident sophistication she'd cultivated for years. "Madison, people have been calling me all morning. Reporters, friends of Eleanor's, even strangers who saw the news story. Everyone wants to know about our parents' technology business that apparently doesn't exist." "Where's Marcus?" I asked. "He left 2 hours ago. Said he needed time to think about some things that had come to his attention. Madison, I think he knows. I think Eleanor hired those investigators early, and they've already started digging into our background." The timeline was accelerating beyond our ability to control it. Professional investigators working simultaneously with investigative journalists would quickly piece together the complete truth about Emma's deception and my financial involvement. "Have you spoken to Eleanor directly?" I asked. Emma's voice broke completely. "She's been in her office all morning making phone calls. The housekeeper told me she's been speaking with business associates about family matters. Marcus's sister, Catherine, looked at me at breakfast like I was some kind of criminal. The Richardson family was conducting their own damage assessment, probably consulting lawyers and public relations specialists about how to handle a potential scandal involving their son's fiancée. Emma's position at their ranch was becoming untenable as suspicion mounted. "Pack your things and come to my house immediately," I instructed. "We need to decide how to handle this before it gets any worse." But events were already spiraling beyond our control. While Emma gathered her belongings under the watchful eyes of increasingly suspicious Richardson family members, Jennifer Walsh was making calls that would soon expose every aspect of our elaborate deception. Her first breakthrough came when she contacted the Tyler Chamber of Commerce to research the Palmer family's business history. Within an hour, she'd confirmed that Palmer Hardware had been a prominent local business, that Robert Carter Palmer had been well known in the community, and that the business had been sold to a national chain 3 years earlier. Her second breakthrough came when she connected with Palmer Hardware's former employees, many of whom were eager to share positive memories of Robert Palmer and his dedication to the business. Bill Martinez agreed to an on-camera interview, thinking he was helping to set the record straight about a family he'd known for decades. "Robert Palmer was one of the finest men I ever worked with," Bill told Jennifer Walsh's camera crew, standing outside the former Tyler Palmer Hardware location. "He built this business from nothing, treated his employees like family, and cared about every customer who walked through those doors. His daughter Madison took over after he passed and ran things with the same integrity until she sold to the national chain." When Jennifer asked about Emma, Bill's response was devastating. "Emma never had much interest in the business. She moved away years ago, always felt she was meant for something more sophisticated than hardware retail. Can't say I blame her. Young people have different dreams than their parents. By Tuesday afternoon, Jennifer Walsh had compiled enough information to destroy Emma's credibility completely. She'd confirmed that Palmer Technology Consulting had never existed, that the elaborate online presence had been created recently, and that the Palmer family's actual history bore no resemblance to Emma's claims about successful tech entrepreneurs. But her most damaging discovery came when she started investigating the wedding's financial arrangements. Her experience with Dallas society scandals had taught her to follow the money, and the trail from Magnolia Events LLC led directly to questions about who was actually funding Emma's elaborate celebration. The phone call I'd been dreading came. At 4:30 that afternoon, Jennifer Walsh's number appeared on my screen, and I knew that ignoring it would only delay the inevitable confrontation. "Ms. Carter, this is Jennifer Walsh from Channel 8 News. I'm working on a story about the Palmer family's background, and I'd like to ask you a few questions about your sister's upcoming wedding." Her tone was professional but predatory, the voice of someone who'd found a story worth pursuing regardless of the personal destruction it might cause. "I understand you were the actual owner of Palmer Hardware and that you sold the business for a substantial sum 3 years ago," she continued. "I'm curious about your role in funding your sister's wedding expenses through Magnolia Events LLC." The question confirmed my worst fears. Jennifer Walsh had discovered not just Emma's deception about our family background, but my secret financial involvement in creating her fantasy wedding. The story was expanding from social fraud to questions about enablement and potentially questionable business practices. "I don't discuss my private business arrangements with reporters," I replied, trying to maintain composure despite the panic rising in my chest. "I understand your reluctance to comment," she said smoothly, "but I should mention that my story will air tomorrow evening regardless of whether you participate. I thought you might want the opportunity to provide your perspective on why you chose to secretly fund a wedding where you've been seated at table 23, essentially treated as an inconsequential guest at an event you're personally financing. The humiliation of having my private family dynamics exposed to public scrutiny was almost overwhelming." Jennifer Walsh had identified the most painful aspect of the entire situation, that Emma had relegated me to the social margins while depending completely on my financial generosity. The story I'm preparing raises interesting questions about family dynamics, social climbing, and the lengths people will go to gain acceptance in elite circles, she continued. It also explores the ethics of elaborate deceptions designed to manipulate wealthy families into accepting inappropriate marriage partners. Each word felt like a physical blow. Jennifer Walsh wasn't just exposing Emma's lies. She was framing the entire situation as a calculated con game designed to trick the Richardson family into a fraudulent marriage alliance. "Will you be attending your sister's wedding on Saturday?" she asked. "I have no comment," I managed, ending the call before she could ask additional questions that would further compromise our already hopeless situation. But the damage was done. Within hours, Jennifer Walsh's preliminary reporting had reached Eleanor Richardson through her extensive network of Dallas society connections. The woman who'd spent weeks questioning Emma's background now had confirmation that every suspicion had been justified. Emma called me at 6:15. Sobbing so hard I could barely understand her words. "They know everything," she gasped between sobs. "Eleanor confronted me an hour ago with a preliminary report from her investigators. Marcus was there, and his father, Catherine. They had documentation about Palmer Hardware, about Dad's death, about the business sale. Eleanor kept asking who was funding the wedding if our parents weren't successful entrepreneurs." The confrontation Emma described sounded like a tribunal rather than a family discussion. The Richardson family had assembled to formally address what they now understood to be an elaborate deception perpetrated against their son and their family reputation. "What did you tell them?" I asked. I tried to explain that I'd never meant to deceive anyone, that I'd just wanted to fit in with their expectations. But Eleanor kept pressing about the financial arrangements. She knows someone else is paying for everything, Madison. She demanded to know who and why. The Richardson family's investigation had exposed the fundamental fraud of Emma's identity, but they still didn't understand the full scope of my involvement. That revelation would come tomorrow when Jennifer Walsh's story aired, providing complete details about my role as the secret benefactor who'd enabled Emma's deception. "Where are you now?" I asked. "At a hotel near the airport. Marcus drove me here and said the family needed time to decide how to proceed. He couldn't even look at me, Madison. 3 years of building our relationship, and now he sees me as some kind of fraud who tried to trick his family." The pain in Emma's voice was heartbreaking, but I also felt a surge of anger at her selfishness. Even now, facing the collapse of everything we'd built together, she was focused entirely on her own loss without acknowledging the destruction that was about to rain down on my reputation and business. "The wedding is supposed to be in 4 days," she continued. 400 guests, everything paid for and arranged. What am I supposed to do now?" That question would be answered the next evening when Jennifer Walsh's investigative report aired on Dallas television, exposing every detail of Emma's deception and my secret financial involvement to the entire city. The scandal that had begun with Bill Martinez's helpful phone call was about to become a public spectacle that would destroy both our reputations and change our lives forever. The Wednesday evening newscast that destroyed everything we'd built began with Jennifer Walsh's perfectly composed introduction. Tonight, an exclusive Channel 8 investigation into one of Dallas society's most anticipated weddings reveals a web of deception that calls into question the true identity of the bride and the source of funding for her elaborate celebration. Watched from my living room as Emma's carefully constructed world imploded in real time on television screens across Dallas, Jennifer Walsh had crafted a devastating exposé that methodically dismantled every aspect of Emma's transformation, from her fabricated family background to the mysterious funding sources that had made her fairy tale wedding possible. The report opened with footage of Bill Martinez standing outside the former Palmer Hardware location in Tyler, his weathered face sincere as he shared memories of working alongside Robert Palmer for nearly 4 decades. "He was a good man who built an honest business," Bill said, completely unaware that his words were destroying Emma's life. Nothing fancy about hardware retail, but Robert took pride in serving his community. Jennifer Walsh's narration provided devastating context. The man Bill Martinez describes bears no resemblance to the successful technology entrepreneur Emma Palmer Richardson claimed as her father when she entered Dallas high society 3 years ago. The report included interviews with Tyler Chamber of Commerce officials, former Palmer Hardware customers, and community members who remembered our family's actual history. Each testimonial reinforced the same narrative. We'd been respectable, hard-working people, but nowhere near the sophisticated tech consultants Emma had invented. Then came the segment I'd been dreading most. Jennifer Walsh had obtained surveillance footage from the Fairmont Dallas, showing me at vendor meetings, always positioned as a background figure while Emma made public decisions about arrangements I was privately funding. The footage made our deception obvious even to casual viewers. Channel 8's investigation has revealed that Emma Palmer's elaborate wedding is being secretly funded by her estranged sister Madison Carter, who sold the family hardware business for nearly $13 million 3 years ago, Walsh explained over images of me taking notes during floral consultations. Despite providing the financial foundation for the celebration, Madison Carter has been assigned to table 23 at her sister's reception, positioned in the back corner among service staff. The visual evidence was damning. Viewers could see me relegated to the margins while Emma performed the role of sophisticated bride, accepting credit for arrangements I'd made possible. The optics alone told a story of manipulation and ingratitude that required no additional commentary. But Jennifer Walsh wasn't finished. Her investigation had uncovered documents revealing the Magnolia Events LLC structure Patricia and I had created to hide my financial involvement. The paper trail shows elaborate efforts to conceal the funding source, Walsh reported, raising questions about why such deception was necessary if the arrangement were genuinely charitable. The story concluded with attempts to reach both Emma and me for comment. Our refusals to participate presented as evidence of guilt rather than privacy preferences. Jennifer Walsh's final summary was devastating. Tomorrow evening, 400 of Dallas's most prominent citizens are scheduled to attend what they believe is a celebration of love between social equals. Instead, they may be witnessing the culmination of an elaborate deception designed to secure wealth and status through fraudulent means. My phone began ringing before the broadcast ended. Patricia called first, her voice tight with concern about potential damage to our business reputation. Madison, we need to discuss crisis management immediately. This story is already spreading beyond Dallas. I've received calls from associates in Houston and Atlanta asking about your involvement in this scandal. The professional implications I'd feared were materializing rapidly. Hartwell Investments depended on trust and reputation among sophisticated clients who expected discretion and ethical behavior. Being portrayed as the enabler of elaborate social fraud would undermine everything I'd built since selling Palmer Hardware. Emma called 20 minutes later, her voice raw from hours of crying. Madison, it's over. Marcus just called to formally end our engagement. The Richardson family has issued a statement through their attorney saying the wedding is canceled due to irreconcilable differences regarding family backgrounds and financial arrangements. The formal language couldn't disguise the humiliation Emma was experiencing. After 3 years of carefully cultivating her relationship with Marcus, building connections within his family, and transforming herself into what she believed was his ideal partner, everything had collapsed within hours of the truth being revealed. What? About the deposits, the vendors, the guests? I asked, already calculating the financial and logistical nightmare of canceling a $400,000 wedding just days before it was scheduled to occur. Eleanor Richardson's attorney contacted all the vendors today. They're claiming breach of contract due to misrepresentation and trying to recover the Richardson family's expenses. Madison? They're saying I defrauded them. The legal implications were potentially serious. If the Richardson family could prove that Emma had entered into her engagement under false pretenses, they might have grounds for civil litigation seeking damages for emotional distress, wedding expenses, and reputational harm. But my immediate concern was protecting myself from legal liability. While I'd funded the wedding voluntarily, my involvement in creating the fictional Palmer Technology Consulting background could be construed as conspiracy to commit fraud if prosecutors decided to pursue criminal charges. Have you spoken to a lawyer? I asked. I can't afford a lawyer, Emma replied, the irony of her situation fully apparent. Despite her 3 years of performing wealth and sophistication, she had no actual resources to defend herself when the fantasy collapsed. She'd invested everything in social transformation while building no financial foundation of her own. Thursday morning brought a new wave of complications when I arrived at my office to find reporters waiting in the parking garage. Jennifer Walsh's story had generated enough interest to justify follow-up coverage, and my refusal to comment publicly was being interpreted as admission of wrongdoing. Ms. Carter, can you explain why you secretly funded your sister's wedding while being treated as an insignificant guest? One reporter called out as I hurried toward the elevator. Are you concerned about potential fraud charges related to the fake business you helped create? Another shouted. The questions followed me into the building, their implications devastating to my professional reputation. Clients and business partners were witnessing me portrayed as either a victim of family manipulation or a conspirator in elaborate social fraud. Neither characterization was acceptable for someone managing their investments. Patricia had prepared a comprehensive damage assessment by the time I reached my office. We've received 47 calls since the story aired, she reported. 12 from existing clients expressing concern about your judgment, 8 from prospective clients withdrawing from consideration for our services, 15 from reporters seeking additional information, and 12 from what appear to be opportunistic, attorneys suggesting we might have grounds for civil action against your sister. The business impact was immediate and potentially permanent. Investment management depended entirely on trust and reputation. Once those were compromised, recovering client confidence could take years even if legal issues were resolved favorably. There's more, Patricia continued. Eleanor Richardson's attorney has requested all documentation related to Magnolia Events LLC and your financial involvement in the wedding arrangements. They're apparently building a case for intentional misrepresentation that damaged their family's reputation. The Richardson family's legal strategy was becoming clear. Rather than simply absorbing the embarrassment of their son's broken engagement, they were positioning themselves as victims of deliberate fraud perpetrated by Emma and enabled by my financial support. My attorney, David Morrison, arrived for an emergency consultation at 10 a.m. His assessment of our legal exposure was sobering. The criminal fraud potential is limited, he explained, because you didn't directly profit from the deception, and Emma's relationship with Marcus appears to have been genuine despite the false background. But the civil liability could be substantial if the Richardson family can prove their damages and establish your knowing participation in the misrepresentation. David's advice was pragmatic but painful. We need to distance you from Emma's deception immediately and completely. Any appearance of ongoing collaboration will strengthen the Richardson family's case that this was a coordinated fraud, rather than a family member helping with wedding expenses. The recommendation meant abandoning Emma when she was most vulnerable, but continuing to support her could expose me to legal liability that might destroy everything I'd built professionally. The sister who'd already cost me hundreds of thousands of dollars was now threatening my business reputation and potentially my financial future. That afternoon brought the confrontation I'd been dreading when Emma arrived at my office unannounced. Her appearance shocking evidence of how completely her world had collapsed. Her hair was unwashed, her designer clothes wrinkled from sleeping in them, her makeup smeared from hours of crying. "Madison, I need your help," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk with the exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept in days. The Richardson family is demanding I return engagement gifts worth over $200,000. They're threatening to sue me for fraud if I don't reimburse them for wedding expenses they'd already covered. The financial demands Emma described would bankrupt someone with no assets or income sources. She'd spent 3 years living off credit, cards, and Marcus's generosity while building her social identity, accumulating debt rather than savings. "I can't pay them back," she continued. "I have nothing, Madison. No money, no job skills they'd respect, no friends who aren't connected to Marcus somehow. Everything I built was dependent on marrying into his family." Her desperation was genuine and heartbreaking, but I also felt a surge of anger at her continued failure to acknowledge the role her choices had played in creating this disaster. "Emma, I've already lost clients because of this scandal," I said carefully. "My attorney has advised me to maintain distance from your situation to protect my business interests." Her face crumpled with disbelief. "You're abandoning me? After everything we've been through together?" "After everything you put us through," I corrected. "Emma, you created this situation by lying about our family, lying about your background, and expecting me to fund your transformation without acknowledging my sacrifice." The argument that followed was the most honest conversation we'd had in years. Emma accused me of conditional love, of supporting her only when it was convenient. I accused her of selfishness, of taking my generosity for granted while treating me as an embarrassment. "I never asked you to be ashamed of our family," I said. "I never asked you to erase Dad's memory or pretend Mom didn't exist. You made those choices because you valued status over relationships." "You don't understand the pressure I was under," Emma replied. "The Richardson family expects certain standards. I had to become someone worthy of their acceptance." "No, you chose to become someone else entirely. There's a difference." But as our argument continued, I began to understand that Emma's transformation hadn't been purely selfish. She genuinely believed that reinventing herself was necessary for survival in the world she'd chosen. Her deception hadn't been calculated. Manipulation, but desperate adaptation to social expectations she couldn't meet authentically. The conversation ended with both of us emotionally drained, but no closer to resolution. Emma left my office facing bankruptcy and potential legal action, while I confronted the reality that protecting my business might require permanently severing our relationship. That evening, alone in my apartment, I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what we'd lost. The sister I'd tried to help had disappeared into a performance that ultimately destroyed both our lives. The family bonds I'd hoped to preserve had been sacrificed to social ambitions that proved impossible to sustain. But most painfully, I realized that my attempts to enable Emma's transformation had made me complicit in erasing our parents' memory and denying the value of everything they'd built. In trying to save my sister, I'd betrayed the principles my father had lived by and the integrity he'd tried to teach us both. 6 months after the wedding that never happened, I found myself standing in the lobby of a modest law office in Tyler, Texas, waiting to sign papers that would close the final chapter of Palmer Hardware's legacy. The building was nothing like the gleaming downtown Dallas towers where I usually conducted business, but there was something comforting about its unpretentious functionality. The intervening months had been the most challenging of my life. The scandal that destroyed Emma's social aspirations had nearly destroyed my business as well. Hartwell Investments lost 30% of its clients in the immediate aftermath of Jennifer Walsh's exposé, and rebuilding trust had required complete transparency about my motivations and decision-making process. "The Palmer Foundation documents are ready for your signature," announced Janet Phillips, the estate attorney who'd helped me navigate the complex process of establishing a charitable foundation in my parents' memory. "This represents one of the most significant educational endowments East Texas has ever received. The Palmer Foundation would distribute $5 million over 10 years to support vocational training programs for students pursuing careers in skilled trades." The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using money from selling Dad's hardware business to honor the kind of practical education he'd always valued over the sophisticated credentials Emma and I had pursued. "Your parents would be proud," Janet continued, sliding the incorporation papers across her desk. "Robert Palmer understood the dignity of skilled work. This foundation ensures that understanding lives on." As I signed each document, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The months following Emma's scandal had forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about my own motivations and values. Had I enabled Emma's deception because I genuinely wanted to help her? Or because I'd been ashamed of our modest origins, too? The process of rebuilding my business reputation had required confronting that question honestly. During meetings with clients who'd stayed loyal despite the scandal, I'd found myself talking openly about Palmer Hardware for the first time in years. Instead of minimizing our family's retail background, I'd started sharing stories about Dad's integrity and the satisfaction he'd found in solving customers' practical problems. "You know," one client had said after hearing about Dad's approach to business, "that sounds like exactly the kind of ethical foundation I want in my investment advisor. Your father understood that real success comes from serving others, not from impressing them." Those conversations had taught me that authenticity attracted better clients than sophistication ever could. The investors who'd remained with Hartwell Investments after the scandal were those who valued substance over style, exactly the kind of people Dad would have respected. Emma's situation had evolved differently. The legal troubles she'd faced, immediately after the wedding cancellation had been resolved through negotiations that required her to return engagement gifts and formally acknowledge her misrepresentation of family background. But the social consequences had been permanent and devastating. Dallas society had no tolerance for the kind of deception Emma had perpetrated. The Richardson family's social influence ensured that she would never be welcomed back into the circles she'd worked so hard to join. Former friends avoided her, invitations stopped arriving, and the carefully constructed identity she'd spent years building simply evaporated. "I received a letter from Emma yesterday," I told Janet as we concluded the foundation paperwork. "She's been living in Austin, working as a coordinator for a nonprofit that helps women transition out of domestic violence situations." The transformation Emma had undergone in the past 6 months was as dramatic as her earlier reinvention, but this time it seemed genuine rather than performed. Stripped of her social pretensions and forced to rebuild from nothing, she'd discovered skills and interests she'd never acknowledged before. She wrote that helping women recreate their lives after leaving abusive relationships has taught her something about authentic identity versus performed identity, I continued. She said she finally understands the difference between becoming someone new and pretending to be someone you're not. Emma's letter had been the first honest communication I'd received from her in years. She'd acknowledged the pain her choices had caused, accepted responsibility for the consequences we'd both faced, and expressed genuine remorse for erasing our parents' memory in pursuit of social acceptance. But perhaps most importantly, she'd stopped asking for financial help. Her job at the Austin nonprofit paid modestly, but she was supporting herself entirely through her own efforts for the first time since leaving home. The independence she'd gained seemed to matter more to her than the luxury she'd lost. "Are you planning to reconcile with your sister?" Janet asked as we walked toward the lobby. "We're talking regularly now," I replied. "But rebuilding trust takes time. Emma needs to prove to herself that she can live authentically before we can rebuild our relationship completely." The drive back to Dallas gave me time to reflect on how profoundly the wedding scandal had changed both our lives. Emma had lost everything she'd thought she wanted, but discovered work that gave her genuine purpose. I'd faced a professional crisis, but emerged with a clearer understanding of my own values and priorities. The Palmer Foundation represented more than charitable giving. It was a commitment to honoring the principles Dad had lived by, even when those principles weren't fashionable or prestigious. Supporting vocational education meant acknowledging that skilled trades were as valuable as investment management, that practical problem-solving deserved as much respect as financial analysis. Back in Dallas, I drove past the Fairmont where Emma's wedding should have taken place. The building looked unchanged, still elegant and impressive, still hosting elaborate celebrations for families wealthy enough to afford such luxury. But I no longer felt intimidated by that world or impressed by its exclusivity. The real revelation of the past 6 months hadn't been about Emma's deception or the Richardson family's social power. It had been about understanding that genuine success couldn't be performed or purchased. It had to be earned through choices that aligned with authentic values. My phone rang as I parked outside my office building. Emma's number appeared on the screen, and I answered with none of the tension that had characterized our conversations for years. "Madison, I wanted to thank you for something," she said, her voice carrying a warmth I hadn't heard since our childhood. "I just finished reading the news article about the Palmer Foundation. Dad would have been so proud of what you're doing with the money from the business sale." "I think he'd be proud of both of us," I replied. "You're helping women rebuild their lives authentically. That's exactly the kind of meaningful work he'd respect." Our conversation continued for 20 minutes, covering Emma's work, my business recovery, and our shared memories of Dad's approach to treating people with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. For the first time in years, we talked as sisters rather than competitors or strangers. "I have something to tell you," Emma said as our call ended. "I've been seeing someone. His name is David, and he's a social worker who specializes in helping kids from troubled backgrounds. He knows everything about my past. The wedding scandal, the lies I told, the mess I made of things. And he accepts me anyway." The relief in Emma's voice was unmistakable. She'd found someone who valued her authentic self rather than the sophisticated persona she'd tried to maintain. More importantly, she'd learned to value herself enough to be honest about her history rather than constructing new deceptions. "I'm happy for you," I said, genuinely meaning it. Authenticity attracts the right people into your life. After ending the call, I sat in my car for several minutes, thinking about the journey that had brought us both to this point. The wedding that never happened had been the catalyst for transformations neither of us could have anticipated. Emma had lost her fantasy life, but found her authentic self. I'd faced a professional crisis, but discovered the courage to honor my family's real history. The final chapter of our story wasn't the fairy tale ending Emma had originally planned. There was no grand ballroom, no society wedding, no transformation into Dallas royalty. Instead, there was something more valuable: the reconstruction of authentic relationships based on truth rather than deception. 6 months later, I received an invitation that completed our family's journey full circle. Emma was getting married again, this time in a simple ceremony at a community center in Austin. The invitation was handwritten on plain cardstock, her words genuine rather than carefully crafted. "Madison, I would be honored if you would stand beside me as my maid of honor when I marry David next month. This time, everything will be real. The love, the vows, the family celebrating together. I want the people who matter most to witness the woman I've actually become, not the person I pretended to be." The ceremony took place on a sunny Saturday afternoon in October. About 50 people attended: Emma's co-workers, David's family, a few friends from their shared volunteer work, and Mom, who'd driven down from Tyler wearing Dad's favorite pearl necklace. I stood beside Emma as she exchanged vows with David, watching her face glow with genuine happiness rather than performed satisfaction. The wedding cost less than Emma's shoes had cost for the Richardson celebration, but the joy was authentic and the promises were real. During the reception, held in the same community center with catering provided by a local restaurant, Emma gave a short speech that brought tears to many eyes. "A year ago, I thought happiness meant convincing other people I was someone impressive," she said, holding David's hand as she addressed their guests. "I learned that real happiness comes from finding someone who loves the person you actually are, not the person you think you should be." Later that evening, as we cleaned up paper plates and folded metal chairs, Emma and I had our most important conversation ever. "Thank you for not giving up on me," she said as we loaded decorations into her car. "I know I didn't deserve your help after the way I treated you and our family's memory." "We're sisters," I replied simply. "That means we help each other find our way back when we get lost." The drive back to Dallas the next morning felt different than any journey I'd taken in years. Emma had found authentic love with someone who valued her real history. Mom had seen both her daughters happy and settled. The Palmer Foundation was supporting young people who shared Dad's respect for skilled work and practical problem solving. Most importantly, our family's story no longer ended with deception and scandal. It ended with redemption, with the understanding that genuine relationships were worth more than social status, and with the knowledge that it's never too late to choose authenticity over performance. The wedding that never happened had taught us all something valuable. The most elaborate celebration means nothing if it's built on lies, but the simplest ceremony can be profound when it's based on truth. Emma had learned that lesson the hard way, but she'd learned it completely, and sometimes that's the most valuable education of all. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.